So hello there and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, the show where we talk all of the latest news, gossip, events in the world of Formula 1 for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending on which platform, of course, you choose to follow us on. And guys, I just want to wish you all a very, very happy new year. It's the first podcast that we've done in 2022. And after so much that has gone on in 2021, so much to look back on, so much, of course, that we've talked about, and so much to remember for years and years to come, especially the dramatic finale that we saw, whether you agreed with it or not, we, of course, are going to be looking ahead to 2022. And there's no better way of doing that than looking at the big stories for 2022 in the F1 world, as the new season is only just a few months away, probably a lot closer than that, the way I described it, but before you know it, you're going to be seeing the new cars breaking cover and F1 testing, and then we'll be back at the first race of the season. And I certainly cannot wait to see some new rivalries and some old ones reconvening for the season to commence. But joining us on this episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, as always, is my co-host, Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing? Loving the new studio look that you've been advertising on the socials. Looking rather good, looking sharp.
Well, that's what the lighting does, mate. Lighting does wonders. But yeah, got a studio upgrade for the 2022 season. You know, because we plan to take the channel to the next level. So yeah, I hope it helps in some capacity. But yeah, doing well. Hope everyone had a good festive period. And I've been banging on about this coming season for a very long time. So I can't wait to discuss topics that this episode has to offer.
Yeah, sounds very, very encouraging. It's nice to see you've got the couple of the Union Jack flags in there, just so that we can carry on with that British bias that we apparently have on this show. So,
fanboys.
Yeah, we're still going to keep that going because there's no way to avoid it, unfortunately. I mean, it's funny because I mention this in jest because we get comments about being Hamilton fanboys, we get comments about British bias, we get comments about being Hamilton haters. From, so if we're getting that from both sides of the argument with your pro Max or pro Liz, we must be doing it right if we're calling it right down the middle by that logic.
Do you know it's the equivalent of? So, because you only mainly get this on YouTube, it's the equivalent of the Twitter virgins that you get that just pop ratio under every comment.
Oh, God.
I feel like that's what we get.
I feel like this video is going to be comment after comment with just ratio. So, yeah. Can't say I'm looking forward to that one. Anyway, that all aside, joining us once again, as always, our newest member of the DNF1 family, fresh for 2022. It's Lee Wallington. Lee, same as Courtney, how are you doing? And looking good as always?
I'm good, thank you. Hope you all had a nice New Year's. Just looking in the footage here, I'm like, I really need a haircut.
Yeah, I mean, I had one about 6-7 weeks ago for my brother's wedding, and I already feel like I need a new one. It's already starting to get a bit out of control and that, so I feel you on that one, but I'll leave you to sort yourself out and look sharp by the time we get round to testing anyway. I'm sure the missus doesn't mind too much, or maybe she does, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, of course, let's get right back to the 2022 action, and as I said already, guys, there's a lot of big stories that we knew was going to be taking shape at 2022. There's a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement in the air, in preparation, if you like, for this season and the anticipation of what could potentially be a huge, huge moment in F1 history on the back of otherwise one of its greatest ever seasons. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of expectation, and hopefully it can deliver. But as always, guys, if you do enjoy this podcast, before I do get into this, make sure to leave a like if you are watching on YouTube and consider subscribing to the channel. We are targeting to try and get to 500 subscribers soon, so we could really use your help. If you haven't already and you'd like to, please consider subscribing. It's absolutely free. And you can also do the same if you are following us on your favorite podcasting platforms, wherever that may be around the world. We really appreciate you inviting us into your lives to discuss our shared passion of Formula 1. So thank you so much for supporting us, and we hope you continue to do so long into 2022. We've got a lot of good stuff planned for the future. Now, plugging aside, let's get into the big talking points for F1 2022. And I want to start with the biggest one of all, the new cars. You know, these new cars that we've been talking about and discussing and imagining in our heads for years now, about 3 or 4 years that these have been in the pipeline. Of course, they were homologated a year back owing to the pandemic and all of the constraints caused with that, with money and everything else that went with that. Now we're finally going to see these new cars break cover. And it's quite interesting to see how they are going to look. But before we get into that, I just want to ask you guys, whilst we're here, how you feel about saying goodbye to the last generation of cars that we've enjoyed for the last few years, from 2018 to 2021, these big machines, these super downforce, super fast cars that were setting lap records left, right and centre. We're now going to be moving from those and moving to a brand new 2022 car, which of course promises a bit less downforce and less speed, but not as much as we thought. So, Courtney, I want to get your thoughts on this first. How do you feel about saying goodbye to the previous generation of cars? Do you think that that particular concept was a success for racing?
I mean, the nerdy part of me is going to miss seeing the way that these cars, well, the previous era, the way they stuck to the track and obviously gave us the lightning fast lap times that they gave us. But I think overall, I think Formula One's been in need of a restart for quite a while now. I think particularly given the circumstances in which the season ended in 2021, F1 is very much in need of a fresh start. And I'm really hoping that not only do these regulation changes bring more teams into the mix, but also gives us better racing, because, you know, for a very, very long time, we've had issues with cars struggling to overtake because these guys are so damn good at making cars that are aerodynamically efficient. It obviously gives off a lot of dirty air, which affects the car being able to overtake. So let's hope that with these changes, we'll be able to see more overtakes and not as much reliance on DRS. So we want to be seeing some bold moves and parts of the circuits we haven't seen for many years. That'd be great to see.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, we shouldn't forget when we talk about the success, or how successful, or how can I put this? How good these cars were at achieving their goals in the landscape of Formula One. You know, were they able to deliver on what F1 ultimately wanted? You know, were they able to provide the racing, the excitement that we wanted to see? I suppose in some ways you could argue that they did, in terms of the blistering lap times that they delivered and the speed that you could carry in them. But then in other ways you would say that they were lacking for things that a lot of us kind of expected them to lack for. And that was, as you mentioned, Courtney, producing close racing. We never really saw that for guys, you know, in cars that were quite equal in performance. You would find situations where there'd have to be plenty of variables or factors like tyre wear or fuel loads or engine modes and etc., and sometimes driver ability to try and bridge those gaps, where, you know, in the wake of the dirty air, the turbulent air that would cause them to lose performance, you'd almost feel that these new regulations, these new cars are derivative of the shortcomings of the previous generation, and hopefully they will deliver on that. Lee, I'm quite interested to get your thoughts on this one as well. What are your thoughts now on the previous generation of cars, now that we are saying goodbye to those and moving on to this hotly anticipated generation of cars, which should really mitigate the shortcomings of the previous spec?
I mean, I'm a bit of a mixed emotions. I do agree with Courtney on the aspect of the sheer technical marvelous of the cars. It will be a bit depressing this year when it comes to qualifying, when they'll do the lap records and it's like, oh, this lap is 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. I don't know what the actual lap time is going to do, but it's not going to be as fast as it was last year or the previous years. So it's going to be a big gap. And that's a bit sad. It will take a few years to get those quicker lap times potentially. Don't know, obviously, see how these cars develop. So on that, get the words out, Lee, the pure performance side of things, that will be depressing to see, at least for me anyway. But that's only a single lap, and there's a lot more to the whole race weekend than just a single lap performance. But on the other hand, as you both touched on, is the draggy air and the racing. Formula One has a tendency to reinvent itself every few years because there's always someone dominating for the most part. We need to change it up. Let's make it fair. But in that time that someone's dominating, the field is always closing. You get better racing towards the end. Like the last few years, the midfield has really closed together, apart from Haas, who's fallen away. And they were getting closer to the front of the field. And potentially we could have this year that gap gets really big again. And what's supposed to be close racing isn't close racing because the teams aren't in competitive performance to each other. So yeah, it's going to be swings and roundabouts. So that's at least how I feel about it.
Yeah, there's definitely that fear that whilst the objective is to try and close the field up or to try and reset the playing field, that you could end up with a situation that teams that have spent so much money and resources to try and bridge the gap to the top teams from the midfield perspective to the point where they are relatively competitive to a degree, or at some circuits they may even win, as we saw a few times last season. You could end up creating a scenario where one of the top teams absolutely nails the regulations and we end up with a one-team championship, as we have done for quite a lot of the turbo hybrid era in Mercedes. And of course, nobody wants that, but that is kind of the devil in the detail, I suppose, the risk that you take with this sort of situation. But, looking at the best case scenario, or perhaps what is the most realistic scenario, I think a lot of people have been drawing attention to the possibility that we're going to have a lot closer racing, which of course is something that we want. But at the same time, some people have even touted the possibility of a 3-car, perhaps 4-car championship in terms of teams. Most likely the leading protagonists, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren. But is there a realistic possibility that we're going to see something like that, or perhaps more teams being thrown into the mix? Or do you guys feel that it's more likely that we're going to see the top teams in Red Bull and Mercedes at the front as they have been, and perhaps teams like Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, Aston Martin, for example, might be a lot closer to them with a view to them eventually catching those top two in 2023? What are your thoughts on this one, guys?
I think we need to keep an eye on Alpine and Aston Martin in particular. I think there's a reason why Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel have stayed in Formula One with the particular teams that they've chosen to be with. I think Fernando Alonso is very bullish about this season. I think this is going to be L plan, exactly. This is the season where he's going to really hope to be up there again. And let's be honest, most of the fans want to see Fernando Alonso come up against this young generation. So let's hope they can do it. Aston Martin, again, they're a very ambitious team. So they could be up there again. But for me, I've been saying it to you for a while in particular, Adam. I've just got a feeling about Ferrari next season. And if for whatever reason they end up dominating, I think we could be seeing a great battle between Leclerc and Sainz. So I think there are so many plots that could be exciting, even if a team does dominate. So I think there are many reasons why we should be looking forward to next season, regardless of what we see.
Yeah, there's a lot to take from that. I mean, I hope that you're right, Courtney, that Ferrari in particular managed to absolutely nail this. I mean, depending on who you follow or what media outlets you follow, I hear a lot of noises coming out of people with connections to Ferrari or reporting for Ferrari, only saying nothing but good things. I also heard a few stories coming from the Alpine camp in the last couple of weeks in particular, and what Mercedes are doing, or what Red Bull are planning to be doing, or what Williams are planning to be doing. So you're kind of in that mindset where you're seeing so many different outlets talking about so many different teams, everyone feeling positive, everyone feeling buoyant about their chances, to the point where, well, one of them is bound to be right, or perhaps none of them are right, that they've overestimated, and then someone else comes along and absolutely, like Aston Martin, for example, they could come from absolutely nowhere and produce a brand new car for the first time in 3 years that's their own, and then dominate the field, and expedite Lawrence Stroll's plan by 3 or 4 years. So it is possible. Lee, what are your thoughts on this? Are you expecting the same protagonists to be at the very front to begin with, or do you feel that there's a potential that we may see, not necessarily a team like Haas, for example? This is not to shame them or to throw dust their way, but I'm thinking someone like an Alpine or an AlphaTauri or an Aston Martin come up with a very clever innovation that allows them to leapfrog quite a few teams in the midfield and join the leading pack, perhaps lead the field themselves for a while.
You have to look at the history of Formula One. You go to more recent history, before the turbo hybrid era, the 2009 regulation change, and Braun. That was a failed team a few months before the start of the season, and they won the championship. And obviously, that became Mercedes as a team. So there's always the opportunity. You even look back at Red Bull in 2008. Red Bull was a midfield team. You weren't even touching McLaren or Ferrari, but 2009 They were a bit behind that Bourne GP, but they got there for their 2010 Championship Challenge as the car came to them through 2009. So there's always that potential. And you think, compared to the state of the field how it was a decade ago, the teams seem to be a lot more well funded. Obviously, we don't have the poor man teams, so to speak, with Marussia, Virgin, GPO, or it's different guys. Is Caterham. What was the other one? Forgotten the third team that
HRT, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, the
HRT that failed, and you could argue that Haas is probably the weakest funded team, but even that still has some really good financial funding from different areas. Well, obviously with the owner and obviously Mazepin Senior on the sidelines. So there is a great opportunity. It's just down to obviously resource management and using it correctly. And I think Ferrari's, I know it's their logo, but it's the potential dark horse sitting on the sidelines. I mean, McLaren, I think, tried a lot harder to stay ahead of Ferrari than Ferrari tried harder to get ahead of McLaren. And as we've seen, a title battle can hinder development of your car for next season. Even as much as Mercedes and Red Bull were saying, oh yeah, we've got this, we're doing it right. No one knows.
Well, I mean, the running joke that Christian Horner and Toto Wolff kind of went with is that, when people were asking about have they spent enough time on their 2022 cars or have they focused too much on last season's battle and will it affect them? And they both kind of ran with the line that, well, if Ferrari turn up with the best car by a mile next season, we all know that we spent too much time on the 2021 car. And as you said, you rightly pointed out, there were some teams, Ferrari being one of them, that did allocate primarily most of its resources to 2022. Knowing that 2021 they had a good car, they would do what they can to try and achieve their objectives, and if they could get third in the constructors and produce a championship competing car in 2022, then they know that they've done their job. And well, they're halfway there. We'll just have to wait and see. And McLaren's another team that could also say that they've allocated a decent number of resources. Haas, obviously not championship worthy, at least as far as we are aware of. Who knows? We could see Mazepin and Schumacher having a Rosberg versus Hamilton-like battle next season. That would certainly be one for the F1 history books. But the point is rather valid. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of time that they spent on something necessarily will, correlate into a championship-winning car. It just means that they've been able to allocate more time and resources so that their chances would be more likely. Again, we'll have to wait and see. But the reason why I bring this up is because there's a lot of, how can I put this? There's a lot of detail in these new regulations. There's about 170 odd pages, and I've not scoured through them all. And even if I did, I am in no way in a position or any capacity to be able to say how these cars are going to look. What these teams are going to look out for. They seem rather prescriptive in terms of there's not really much scope for a design concept that teams can go on as a base and then work with it there. So it's going to be rather interesting to see what concepts people come up with. I suppose one thing I will say is that back when we had the British Grand Prix, we had the show car that F1 produced as a model to try and show off to everyone what this 2022 car would potentially look like. One thing I remember was that none of the drivers there, none of the teams that were there looked at that car and thought, oh, wow, that's what our car looks like. They all kind of went with it as our car looks completely different to that one. So, or, there are certain nuances of that car that don't match up with what we're doing. So I suppose that's rather encouraging from a design perspective because it means we could get quite a few different solutions, a few different variations, so that we won't need to have to rely on the liveries in order to determine which car is which. I mean, obviously some stand out more than others, but the last thing you want to do is see 10 identical cars, all with different colours, because you end up with a single chassis series. And whilst that may seem appealing to some, that's not necessarily what Formula One is about. So, yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see how that kind of transpires. I mean, let's go with the hypothetical situation that perhaps we see a midfield team like an Alpine. Let's just pick Alpine out at random, and they come up with a really clever innovation that springboards them to the front of the field. The challenge for them is to not only protect that advantage that they have, but to try and build on that. And I think with these rules that we're getting for 2022, That's going to be the real challenge. You know, we may see a situation where someone has come up with an amazing solution for something with the diffuser or a loophole in the regulations that the rule makers themselves couldn't even find, and they were quite determined to make them as robust as possible, we should add. They're going to have a really hard time, whichever team does this, to protect that advantage, because everyone else coming at this are going to know exactly where that advantage has come from. They'll see something and they'll think, right, it's there, whether it's through how they manage the Venturi systems with the ground effect that, of course, is coming back next season, or the diffusers that I've already mentioned, or something else entirely. It's going to be quite obvious to see, because these cars are going to be a lot more elegant, a lot more simple in design. We're not going to see little aero pieces. We might see intricate details, but only so much that they can do that's permitted in the rules. So with all that in mind, guys, do we feel that perhaps 2022 as a base, we may see the field quite spread out, and with a view to that being closed up by 2023? Or do you feel that we could potentially end up with a 2022 season where everyone's all within a second of each other, which is what F1 would want?
I think, if you're considering what both yourself and Lee just raised, particularly if you have a look at 2009, as Lee said, you saw some new teams come out of nowhere, and Red Bull's still up there to this very day. So let's not rule out that possibility. But I think that's why we're seeing with a lot of these teams, it's one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis on the engines, because obviously with the engine freeze coming up, we discussed this before we come on air, with the engine freeze coming up, they do have to, all the teams have to get it right this season. And also with the likelihood that any concept on the exterior can be copied, any advantage they can get from the engine is going to be as important as ever. So that's why we are seeing, that's why you're seeing Alpine, they're talking about a new engine system they're trying. There's a lot of talk about Ferrari's new engine as well. There's been a hell of a lot of talk about Ferrari's new engine, because Ferrari know if they get this right, they could have an advantage for quite a long while.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There was a lot of talk about Ferrari, of how they've recovered. Apparently, they've recovered the 20 horsepower loss that the E10 fuels that are going to be introduced next year for all the cars have created for all the teams equally. And they've managed to find a power boost on top of what they already had from this new lightweight super engine that they produced, which obviously is going to come with reliability concerns. But, Ferrari, they're going to have to roll the dice on that and see if that works. And if it does, it's a game changer for them. And if it doesn't, it ends up literally blowing up in their faces. Lee, how do you see this for the smaller teams? Because this is kind of the dilemma that they face. We know the bigger teams, even if they don't get this right to start with, as we saw in 2009, where we saw McLaren and Ferrari in particular find themselves at the front end or in the midfield. But over time, as the season progressed, they developed their cars to a point where they were right up there with the leading teams towards the end of the season. And by 2010, two of them were the top three teams in the championship, and one in particular should have won it. So are we going to see, do you think that we could see something similar this season, where if we end up with, the say, Mercedes and Red Bull find themselves in the midfield at the front, do you feel that they will be able to find their way back to the front of the field as within the next 6 months, I suppose, in the season, bearing in mind that we've got the budget constraints in place, the ATR regulation restrictions that those two are going to face being the leading constructors from 2021. I feel like F1 are trying to clip their wings as much as possible to prevent that situation, but do you feel that they're kind of just fighting a losing battle, and that those teams are going to find their way back to the front pretty soon anyway?
Yeah, I was literally just going to mention those restrictions, but yes, I think they will play a key part. Obviously, if using Alpine as your example comes up with this key marvelous system, unless it is involved in the engine, like Courtney mentioned, it's going to be visible to see. Mercedes and Red Bull can go, that's the golden ticket. It'll take me a couple of months to build that. I can throw my nice bit of cash here. All right, the teams all have their budget constraints, but throw this nice bit of cash here. We've got experienced people. They'll sort it. But Alpine, on the other hand, could outdevelop them because they have less restrictions. They probably don't have as much money even with the budget constraints, but they'll have more freedom to try and maintain their advantage. So they'll always be ahead of the curve, but as any curve in performance generally levels out eventually. But I don't see any performance curves flattening out this year. I expect that to come in the coming years, because there's probably a lot to gain in the coming first few years of any regulation change. You see here just how the last set of cars got faster since 2014 aerodynamically, even though they changed some of the regulations as the years went on. They just got faster and faster as they got to know the regulations better. But obviously they're trying to make the racing as fair as possible. But yeah, it's just all the unknowns of where the baselines of all the teams are.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to not forget that obviously the objective ultimately is to improve the racing, as Ross Brawn mentioned, it raceability. And I think one aspect of that is to try and create a set of regulations where if someone has an advantage, they're not going to be able to continue to improve on that and bring in brand new innovations to protect that advantage as much as they can, or even increase it in the way Mercedes did. I mean, I don't think any of us are expecting someone to turn up with an innovation as amazing as DAS or the blown diffuser or anything like that. I don't think F1 want that. I think if someone is going to do it, they're hoping that everybody does it so that this field is going to be as evenly spread as possible. And hopefully by 2023, when we've had a year of running with these new cars and the regulations obviously are quite tight and robust, as we hope they are, and the rule makers certainly hope they are, we'll end up with a situation where everyone is literally within a second to a second and a half of the lead car to the last car. And hopefully for the show, that will create a lot better racing. And as Courtney mentioned earlier, we'll get to a situation where they may need to review whether or not we still need to use DRS. As far as we're aware, DRS is still going to be in use for 2022. But if we see a lot of close racing, where the point where DRS is practically irrelevant and is not necessary, then we may see the way that we may see it changed in the way that it's used. We may see a situation where teams will be allowed to use DRS to close up to the car in front, but when they get within that 1 second window, it will be removed, and they'll have to try and do it the old-fashioned way and leave the emphasis down to the driver. I mean, on a subject of these new cars, we should mention they're going to be a bit heavier. I think they're going to be around up to 790 kilograms, which is extremely heavy, and doesn't really help in terms of what the fans want when they want to see these cars be super, super agile in the way that they were 15, 16 years ago, back when they weighed as much as a fridge freezer, compared to how they are now. And one thing I've noticed a lot of the drivers mention with less downforce and heavier cars, that it's that transition to the slow, fast corners in that sort of middle part of the corner, where the downforce is sort of transitioning on the car, where they're starting to struggle a little bit more, to the point where you might put your foot down on the power as you ease out of a corner, and then as soon as you've got your foot down, the downforce kicks in and you're fine. It's going to be a bit more delayed than that. So we may see a situation where the drivers are having to wrestle the cars a little bit more halfway through a corner, or they may have to try and keep it under control, which will obviously make it a lot more heavier and a bit more difficult for them to handle. So that all sounds rather promising. I just really, really hope that that's the case. I mean, this is based off what a lot of drivers said on the simulators. I think Pierre Gasly mentioned this. The Ferrari drivers mentioned this as well. So what are you guys hoping for in terms of these new cars? Do you want them to become a lot more difficult to drive? Do you want the drivers to feel like that they're a bit more of a challenge than they used to be? Not just a bit, how can I put it, a bit laggy in the slower corners, a bit more lethargic than they used to be, and overall a bit more of a challenge to drive, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we have lacked with the recent regulations is sort of the unpredictability, shall we say, of, when there's a close battle, you kind of know that, like, say through a twisty section of a circuit, that the car in front is going to pretty much have it under control. Whereas actually, if we get what we want from these regulation changes, you could, I don't know, for example, if you have like Verstappen just slightly ahead of Lewis, like just under a second, you could see Max perhaps like lose it a little bit. And there's just that idea of, would he be able to control it? That's what makes the racing more exciting. So I'm hoping we see a lot more scenarios like that. And I think one of the biggest complaints that F1 in general has had for many, many years, because we've had teams dominate. So the most obvious examples I can think of are Schumacher, Vettel, and Hamilton. There's been so many complaints about these drivers winning championships primarily because of the car. If the regulation changes, put it more down to the driver, not only are we going to get more entertaining racing, the actual winners of the championships will get the credit they actually deserve. So let's hope that happens.
Yeah, I mean, on extension of that, how do you feel about the possibility that DRS might be rendered redundant? Is that something we want to see in F1? Because, as I said, I'm kind of sitting on the fence with this in terms of we're kind of hit with two problems. One, that DRS seems to be necessary to get the cars close enough so that they can actually overtake. But by the time they're there, it's almost like a slam dunk overtake. I mean, Saudi Arabia, when Lewis tried to overtake Max, he was half a second behind him, and we all kind of knew as soon as he opens that rear wing, he's just going to breeze past him, although Max made it difficult and went off the road to defend it. But the point is that it just became almost too easy for an overtake to be made, but then without it, the overtake wouldn't have been possible at all.
Yeah, it's finding that balance, isn't it? I think maybe DRS might be needed at some tracks, and sometimes it won't. You know, you have a look at some of the circuits where it's almost impossible to overtake because they're so twisty. Sometimes you might need a little bit of a small DRS section. But personally, I'd rather DRS not be needed. Like if it's needed, then if it's going to make the racing better, then great. But if it's not needed in certain circuits, I'll say get rid of it, because you want to be seeing the purity of racing. You know, like when we went through the controversy the last season, people were annoyed partly because they felt like a result was manufactured. DRS does, to a much lesser extent, do that. It does still sort of make the results more predictable. So let's hope that, look, if we don't need it, get rid of it, and because it just makes the racing less predictable, and that's what we really want. I think we're tired of predictable race results. We really are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Lee, let's come to you on this. What are you hoping for from these cars to deliver? What do you want to see?
Well, I'd say just touching the DRS thing before I carry on with the car point. I completely agree with Courtney that obviously if it's not necessary, we shouldn't have it. But we shouldn't forget the reason why it was brought in. Predominantly Fernando Alonso, get his name right, losing the 2010 championship because he was stuck behind the petrol, because he couldn't overtake because of the aerodynamics. So we need to, it's the right balance, as Courtney said, is if we may need it at some tracks, we may not need it at other tracks. What we don't want is that it's overpowerful and cars just fly by willy-nilly, because that's just defeats the point of close racing. Yes, it makes it interesting because cars overtake every lap, but it's just not going to be fun to watch. Right, fully casual insane it may be, but for the purists, that's probably not what we want. But out of the cars, definitely you want it to be more challenging to the driver to push it, because they say themselves they want to be able to push themselves and say that they're the best because they can drive the car the best, not that their car is the best. And nothing against obviously the younger drivers that have come through recently, but go back 20, 30 years, you didn't get teenagers coming into the sport to drive Formula One cars. They were demanding beasts, and obviously the cars have got easier to drive. They've made it difficult, like they've got rid of automatic gearboxes over the time and things like that. But it's just, there needs to be a bigger step between Formula 2 cars and Formula 1 cars. The difference is so minimal. Now, apart from the engine horsepower, because that's obviously the speeds are quite different, but the actual car handling and that, they need a bigger step up. This is a big beast, or you need a lot more years in the lower categories before you can jump up. And as we've seen with Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen recently, age, being an older driver isn't the thing that it used to be 30 years ago of, oh, you're 40 or you're over the hill, you can't race anymore. That's not what it is anymore. So yeah, that's what I would like to see out of the generation, these new cars.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, being older is actually an advantage. You could argue that despite the knowledge gap that Fernando was obviously trying to bridge, and he was given a lot of opportunities to do that. I remember at the end of 2020 when he was part of the young driver test, and at the ripe old age of, what was it, 39. It's one of those where you just expect good things from someone like Fernando. And Kimi Raikkonen was obviously, he wasn't at the peak of his powers since his McLaren and Ferrari days, and even Lotus to a degree, but he was still very, very fast, more so than his younger teammate of, about 13, 14 years. So there is something to this, and I think these F1 cars, whilst I feel F2 is very, very important to help prep these drivers of tomorrow to be in Formula One, I don't think this should be too much more difficult, but I definitely feel that there should be a big step up that needs to be made. And sometimes we can see the real top stars of the future really rise to that challenge, in the way that we've seen in more recent years, George Russells, the Charles Leclerc, the Norrises, just to name a few, and many more that have come before them, and of course many more that are to come that will be quite intriguing to see. One of which, of course, Oscar Piastri, I would love to have seen in a Formula One car this season, but it looks like we're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get that from him. I want to move on to another topic, because we could go on about these new cars. We could talk about the tyres, but there's not really too much to say on these new tyres because they're going to be bigger, and it's going to be cool to see some of the wheel coverings on them. And the drivers will have that challenge over placement because they've got the fins that are going to be over them as well. But I'm pretty sure that they'll get used to those rather quickly anyway. And it's similar to what we see in the junior categories anyway. So someone like Mick Schumacher or Nikita Mazepin will look at those and think, well, we drove for those before, so this will come right up our street. And in Yuki Tsunoda as well. So, we're going to gloss over that one if we can. I want to talk about some of the driver moves now. Now, we've got 4 driver moves to speak of. We've got George Russell going to Mercedes from Williams. We've got Alex Albon coming back to Formula One to replace George Russell at Williams. And then we've got Valtteri Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou going to Alfa Romeo. Of course, Bottas joining from Mercedes. I think the one that we really are intrigued in, and the one that's going to capture a lot of interest next season, is George Russell going to Mercedes. Now, we've all followed George Russell's career for some time now, since his Formula 3 days, maybe Formula 4 for some earlier than that. And his junior career has been littered with nothing but success. From the moment he stepped into the ART car and he was part of the Mercedes program, it seemed inevitable that George was going to be driving for Mercedes on a permanent basis. We saw that outing in Sakira in 2020. He was absolutely mega on that day and proved to all of us that he could hack it in a fast car. Albeit, he wasn't up against Lewis Hamilton. He was, of course, replacing Lewis while Lewis had to battle COVID that weekend. So it's a very interesting prospect that we've got for next season, where George Russell's going to be coming into a team he knows very well, a team that knows him very well, a team that he has had plenty of time to hone his craft with a Williams team, and now he's going to be able to show the benefits of his labours at Mercedes next season, hopefully up against Lewis Hamilton next season, who will be chomping at the bit for the opportunity to try and go out and win the World Championship that was so cruelly taken away from him last season. So, with all that being said, what are your thoughts, guys, on the George Russell-Lewis Hamilton concept? Because we've got a young driver here that, as I said already, had so many things going for him, but he's going to be in a very unique position now, where some of his companions like Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc and Alex Albon have all had to deal with, and that's try to jump into a big team and wrestle that dominant number one position away from their much more experienced teammate. And to a degree, 2 of those have been able to do that rather successfully. But what do you rate with George's chances? Because he's going to be going up against, I can't think of a much more difficult opponent to go up against in that Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. So how do you think he's going to be doing this season? Are you expecting George to really take it to Lewis and wrestle control, dare I say it? Or do you feel that George is going to be one of those that perhaps he will be quick on most days, but there may be days where he may struggle to keep up with Lewis and by extension, some of the other leading contenders as well?
I reckon it's all going to come down to his race pace. No, look, there's no denying how talented George Russell is as a driver. There's a reason why he's got the seat he's ended up in. But I don't know if it's down to the way the Williams behaved, but we saw how supreme George was on a Saturday. But the race pace, particularly last season, the race pace, he wasn't quite as consistent that some had hoped he'd be. And if he is to better Lewis over the course of the season, the race pace is what he's going to have to improve on. Because I've noticed with Lewis Hamilton the last couple of seasons, Lewis Hamilton's mindset has shifted from, being Mr. Qualifying, holding a record for pole positions. Even during his time at McLaren, Lewis Hamilton was always the guy to beat on Saturdays. Whereas in recent years, I've noticed that Lewis Hamilton hasn't quite tailed off as such on Saturdays, but he's put more of his focus onto the performance of the car on a Sunday. And that's where we saw Lewis get the biggest advantage over Valtteri Bottas. Let's not forget there were times where Valtteri Bottas would beat Lewis on a Saturday, but then on a Sunday, over the long stint on the tyres, Lewis was able just to chip away at Valtteri Bottas until he made a mistake. Now, that's something that George Russell is going to have to deal with, because I have no doubt that George Russell can out-qualify Lewis. The biggest challenge that George is going to face is when he's got a hungry Lewis Hamilton behind him. Or let's not forget, there might be situations where we have Lewis and Max, or Max and Lewis right behind him. So there's gonna be a lot of high pressure scenarios that George Russell hasn't yet to deal with. So that's going to be the biggest challenge he's going to have to face.
And what are your thoughts on this, Lee? What should we expect from George Russell next season? Should we be expecting taking the fight to Lewis? Or, as Courtney said, should we be just looking for certain tangible improvements that will serve him better in the years to come, when he most likely will be the heir apparent to Lewis's throne at Mercedes?
I do agree with Courtney. His focus has to be more on the race. I completely agree. I think George will out-qualify Lewis. Lewis is not slow by any means. He's a very fast driver. And there will be, obviously, Lewis will get poles. But as we know, that the older drivers, the reaction starts to slow down compared to younger drivers. And you just can't push the car as much. You can't react as quickly. Not that Lewis has slowed down by any means. But if you look over the last few years, as Courtney said, although Lewis is the all-time qualifier, the amount of poles has actually decreased compared to his teammates. I think he only got one more pole than Valtteri last year. I think Valtteri out-qualified him in 2020, I believe. Nico Rosberg out-qualified him most of the time through their time together at Mercedes. And so it's not been Lewis's focus. Lewis is, as Courtney said, is all about the race currently. And no, my tyres are gone, and then he goes and sets the fastest lap of the race. That is Lewis. George can't do that. George does make the odd mistake, like any younger driver, but his tyre management is nowhere near where Lewis is, and he will get there. But that's where he will not be able to take the fight to Lewis. He may get on pole, he'd get into the first corner, lead the race, but those tyre strategies, even though Mercedes try to play fair, Lewis knows that I can outrace him, because he's done it to Valtteri, he's done it to Nico, he's done it to Max in different cars. So he knows he can do it, and it's going to be such an interesting dynamic to watch. But obviously, George knows the team. So it's no learning new environment when Lando Norris went into McLaren. Knows who are the engineers, how to do this. George knows Mercedes very well, so he won't have to take as long to catch up in the team, because it's not a new team. So that will be George's ace in the hole.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of look at it from a few different avenues and what I think we're going to be looking for George Russell this season. There's the avenue where you can compare it in a way to his colleagues, that have been in similar positions to this one, where we've seen Lando Norris at McLaren, obviously starting out with Fernando Alonso and then with Carlos Sainz. And, Lando did a good job in the earlier days. He did what McLaren needed him to. He helped to bring them up. There was a lot of potential there that we saw, and he was able to deliver on that most of the time, evidently, even though he comes second best to his teammate. But this season just gone, we needed Lando to make that step up. We needed to see that tangible progress to the point where he was one of the best drivers on the grid last season. It was fantastic. For 2/3 of the season, he was phenomenal. And we saw something like that with Charles Leclerc when he was in the Sauber, impressed in his first season. We saw most of the time he was very, very good. He had the odd mistake, but there was a few performances in particular I think that stood out. I think for me, his early progress in Abu Dhabi, in the Sauber, where he was up into P5 at the start. Obviously, that qualifying lap in Brazil, where he managed to qualify in changeable conditions and managed to somehow get the car through when it looked lost for him. And that was enough for Ferrari to promote him. And then in that season, when there was a lot of pressure on him to deliver against Vettel, who had just come off the back of a second unsuccessful championship challenge with Lewis Hamilton, and Charles Leclerc wrestled control of the team from Sebastian Vettel. He did more than what Ferrari were probably expecting of him, but in a way, probably what Ferrari needed him to do to preserve his future at the team. And Alex Albon, he wasn't really given the time at Red Bull. He was thrusted into that position and he faced the impossible task of trying to not necessarily wrestle control from Max Verstappen, but to sort of be there to help him, even in a season where Red Bull's, didn't really have much of a challenge in front or behind them. It was just too much to deal with, but he was never there. So what I'm saying with George is that those three drivers that I've mentioned have not really had much time to be thrusted into those seats, those major roles, and two of them have obviously succeeded to the point where they are the top driver in their team with respect to their, their number two, although they're probably on equal status now. And then we've got Alex Albon, who's obviously had to take a year out of Formula One and then come back with Williams. Hopefully it's a better year for him, but it proved to be too much too soon, as it did with Pierre Gasly before him. And look what Gasly is doing now. So in George Russell's case, it's a little bit different because he's had quite a lot of time to build up that experience, build up that knowledge at Williams. He's had, I think, 3 seasons now where he's been able to demonstrate his potential. He had that one outing at Mercedes, which, did wonders for his stock with the team and really confirmed that this kid is something special. We just need to hone that talent and try and see what we can do with it. To the point now where he's got all that with him so that he can jump into this new car, this new challenge in the way that Valtteri Bottas did in a similar circumstance. And hopefully for George Russell, he can, to some degree, take it to Lewis Hamilton. I don't think Mercedes are expecting George to be battling Lewis. I think Mercedes will be hoping that he won't be taking points off of Lewis, because I think the last thing that they want is a situation like what we saw last season, where Lewis and Max are going hammer and tongs at each other, but then you add George Russell into the mix, who could potentially be in that fight himself and taking points off of Lewis in the way that Lewis and Fernando were back in 2007 at McLaren, which ultimately was won by Kimi Räikkönen at Ferrari. So it's one of those where I think it's going to have to be well managed by Mercedes, whichever way this goes with George Russell. George Russell, in my opinion, has all the qualities in a driver that you will need to rise to this challenge and learn all the lessons he's going to need to learn. However much he's able to learn from Lewis or from Lewis is going to be up for debate, but I do have confidence that George Russell's going to be able to meet this challenge. What he's going to be able to deliver this season, I don't know. I think we have to be cautiously optimistic with him, but hopefully it will set the foundations that he will need to eventually take that mantle from Lewis. Whether it happens sooner rather than later, we'll have to wait and see. But that's what I think Mercedes are going to be looking for with George, and I have no doubts that he's going to be able to deliver. Courtney, what are your thoughts on what I just said and what Lee's just said as well? Do you feel that that's what George Russell's going to be looking for this season, and do you think he can deliver on that?
There's no doubt that George has the raw pace to challenge the likes of Lewis and Max. It's the consistency over the course of a season. I think we saw, we saw even Lewis and Max themselves crack under pressure at certain moments of last season. Those two drivers in particular, particularly after last season, they're on a different level over the course of a season. It's all well and good doing it over 1, maybe 2 races, but you need to be on a certain level mentally to do that. Now, I'm not saying George. I don't doubt that George can do it, but we're yet to see him under those high pressure scenarios, and that's what I'm most intrigued to see. Because if we see George Russell holding his own against the likes of Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen next season, how exciting is it to have someone else in that upper echelons of Formula One? Because I think the slight worry that some people have is that when Lewis retires, is there going to be anyone that's going to be able to really, truly challenge Max Verstappen? We've kind of been robbed of seeing Charles Leclerc be given the opportunity, given Ferrari's struggle. So in the future, I'm hoping that Leclerc gets himself up there, Russell does, even Norris. Because what we don't want to be seeing is yet again one guy dominating Formula One, because it's harnessed the sport for a long time. Nothing against Max personally, just in case I get Lewis Hamilton fanboy things all over again. I don't care who wins. Obviously, I have my favourites, but if your favourite driver isn't winning, you want to be seeing as many people in the race as possible. And the likes of Leclerc, Norris and Russell in particular, I think they can challenge Max over the course of a season, but they haven't been given the opportunity yet.
Yeah, it does remain to be seen how that would all go down. I think the one takeaway we can take from last season, regardless of how people feel about Max's credentials as world champion, I mean, I think we all agree that Max was a deserving champion. Whether or not we felt that he deserved it more than Lewis is a different debate. And not one that I'm going to entertain on this show. I think we've done that long enough from last year. But I think one thing we can all agree on is that when Lewis does decide to go, and hopefully that's not for a couple of years yet, Max Verstappen is going to be left as the man, the guy to take over that mantle. And you can argue could be just as formidable as Lewis was, you know, based on what we saw last season of how he managed to go toe-to-toe with him. And that's what we want. We want to see those young guys making that step forward. It's going to be a tough ask, and ultimately they may come up short against someone like Max Verstappen in the way that Seb, Fernando, Rosberg most of the time were against Lewis Hamilton. You know, we've seen that. There's no shame in that, but we want to see them in that fight. We want to see that there's a chance that they can beat them. We don't want to see Max roll everybody over and win 7 or 8 world titles. I mean, Max fans might, but we don't want to see him going on and doing what Schumacher did or what Hamilton did, especially in this new era. We want to see, if he's going to win that many titles, we want to see them as close fights. We don't want to see him dominating to the degree that those guys did. That's not what F1 is trying to be now. Let's just hope that George Russell, you know, can make that step up and hopefully really show his credentials, because this is a long time in wait. And of all of the guys that we've mentioned, he's the one that's had the most glowing reference of all of them from his time in Junior Series and what he's done at Williams, etc. So hopefully that will produce the big results now that he's going to be in one of the top teams on the grid. I want to talk briefly about Bottas before we move on. Valtteri Bottas obviously going the other way. He's going to Alfa Romeo. And with all due respect to Alfa Romeo, they're not going to be a team that we expect to be challenging for race wins or a championship this season. But they could make some level of progress. And I think it's going to be important for Valtteri, whilst he's not driving what is potentially going to be a championship-winning car, there is going to be a lot that Alfa Romeo are going to have to benefit from his experience of the working environment at Mercedes, the lessons he's learned there that he can bring to the team, and also the level of feedback that he can give to a team like Alfa Romeo and need to make that step forward. What are we expecting from him next season? Are we expecting Valtteri to really try and take this team up to the next step and fight regularly in the midfield? Or, you know, similar to what Sebastian Vettel was trying to do at Aston Martin? Or do we feel that Valtteri is just going to be able to enjoy his golden F1 years, as it may seem to be, before he goes on to seek pastures new elsewhere? Yeah, what are your guys' thoughts on this? Are you optimistic about what Valtteri can do there? Or do you feel that this is just a project where we've got a driver that could do well, but ultimately it's up to what the team provide for him?
Yeah, it's a fresh start for him. I think he'll be open to go to the new team. It's an opportunity to be the lead driver. I think that's the main thing he'll be looking for. And it would surprise me if he's being promised that to a degree. He's not the top level driver. You know, we saw it during the time in Mercedes. He comes short in some of the moments he was needed the most, particularly last season. But in a team like Alfa Romeo, I think he can certainly do a good job for them. There's no doubting that Valtteri did a great job in helping Mercedes develop the car, particularly in times where they did struggle. Let's not forget the start of last season, Mercedes were behind Red Bull. And I certainly believe that Valtteri Bottas played his part in helping Mercedes catch up. So he's very good on the development side. It's just that consistency over race pace that, you know, we referenced with George Russell. That's Valtteri Bottas's main drawback, I feel. So I just think having a team of his own will help him develop the car more around him, and I think he'll become a better all-round driver for it.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like it's going to be a good move for everybody. You know, it provides Valtteri with an opportunity to be invested in at least a medium-term project to try and bring a team forward, as Sebastian Vettel is at the moment trying to do at Aston Martin. And it also provides Aston Martin with a chance to try and make that necessary step forward without having to go crazy and try and spend a massive amount of money improving their car. It kind of works both ways. I mean, Lee, we've talked about this a lot in how critical the driver can be and how good their input, because you could end up with a situation, especially after Kimi Räikkönen retiring, where there's certain bits of knowledge that Valtteri will bring to this team that could allow them to extract as much as 2 or 3 tenths of a second over the course of a lap without actually having to do anything with the car at all. What are your thoughts on this with Valtteri? How big of an impact do you feel that he could potentially make at Alfa Romeo for their own progress going forward?
So on the racing side of things, Valtteri is quick, especially over one lap. He's still a very good driver. But do you remember his days at Williams where Valtteri would just pull out that performance, so that one lap, and go, what's Valtteri doing there? The Williams wasn't the best of cars at the time, but at minimum, that's what I expect from his new team at Alfa Romeo. Of regardless of the performance, I mean, if it's the best car in the field, he's going to be at the front. But I'm not expecting Alfa Romeo to be at the front, so I expect to be at midfield, and then Valtteri will do these amazing performances and go, wow, that's Valtteri. He's back. Not that he was away, but he's now mentally in a secure place, being the number one driver. From the other side of the car design, yeah, you nail on the head. Of all drivers take their team secrets to a degree when they move around teams. You could say, "Oh, Mercedes did this. Oh, we used to do it like that, and that's Mercedes. This, this. Oh, have you looked at doing that? Because Mercedes did it like that." And it's easy wins. It's just easy wins for Alfa Romeo, especially a midfield team. That could in itself could be a defining moment where they finish in the Constructors' Championship without even developing the car, as you said. So every little helps, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see how that works. I mean, we kind of got a taste of what Alfa Romeo were able to improve a little bit with Kimi in the team. But as I said, Kimi was very much that stable, reliable driver that you knew you could get results from, even though he wasn't at the peak of his powers, and keep the team afloat, for lack of a better way of putting it, until a point where Giovinazzi was on his level, but it was when he was on his way out and just wasn't consistent enough. So hopefully they can make that progress forward with Valtteri, but we'll just have to wait and see for next season, as everyone's gunning for the same thing. Before we move on to sort of the last bits for what to look forward to in 2022, when I hand the floor over to you guys to chuck in some things to look forward to for next season, I just want to go make a quick point on the potential for an interesting silly season. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about silly season, it's kind of the equivalent of the football transfer window, which I believe is open now in January. But this is a bit more strange in F1, where in theory you could go after any driver in any team. All you need to do is get them to agree their contract with you. And obviously, I imagine there's some sort of compensation you'd have to pay to get a driver out of his current contract, depending on who it is. But it does have the potential to create some crazy scenarios. I mean, I remember the year before last season, I should say. We had the huge bombshell that Ferrari were dropping Sebastian Vettel and were replacing him with Carlos Sainz for 2021, and likewise Daniel Ricciardo going to that team as well. And obviously, we had to wait a year for those changes to happen. And then obviously, what followed. Last year was a bit tepid. I think we were expecting George Russell to be confirmed at Mercedes at some point, and it did. And then, of course, Valtteri got his move to Alfa Romeo, and then a few things that sort of happened in the later end of the season. But this year, there is the potential for quite an interesting silly season, usually happening towards the summer break time. So I'm just going to read you off a list of names, and I want to get some of your thoughts on this one as well, guys, whilst we're here before we move on. But this is a current list of the drivers whose contracts expire at the end of the 2022 season. So we have Nikita Mazepin, Mick Schumacher, Guan Yu Zhou, of course, in his first season with 1 year contract, Nicholas Latifi, Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, Sebastian Vettel, Yuki Tsunoda, Pierre Gasly, Fernando Alonso, Carlos Sainz, Sergio Perez, and 2021 champion Max Verstappen, all with contracts ending at the end of the season. I mean, just looking through the list now, that's 13 drivers. That's more than half the grid with contracts up at the end of the season, which, of course, begs the question of how many seats are we going to see change next year? Are we going to see any surprises again with these new cars? The potential pecking order for 2022 could see a few drivers that may have been in a good 2021 car think, well, perhaps I need to look elsewhere, and opportunities may present themselves. So, based on that list, guys, what are your thoughts? There's quite a lot of names there, quite a few high-profile ones as well.
Now, I'm going to throw another thing into this to make it even more complicated. And that is if Lewis chooses to retire next season, because we can't rule it out. He could give the new regulations a go and then choose to retire. Now, the reason why I've raised that is that if Max Verstappen is on the last year of his contract and Mercedes are told that Lewis is going to leave, Verstappen could be tempted to leave Red Bull. And then you have as you know, all it takes is that one change, and all of a sudden you get a domino effect. And I think that's the biggest thing you get with Formula One. Like with football transfers, because there's so many teams and so many players, there isn't usually as much of a domino effect. Whereas a Formula One, if one piece is moved, then it all changes. So I think some of the notable ones, I think Carlos Sainz would be an interesting one. If he see how he battles against Leclerc, if it gets naughty between them two, that could play a role. But I think the most interesting one is Max Verstappen. If Red Bull don't deliver next season, if they have problems with the engine freeze, Max Verstappen is now a world champion. He could be a multiple world champion by the end of next season. That's a bargaining chip. So that could be one to watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, now that Max Verstappen has won a world championship at Red Bull, you would almost feel that, well, Red Bull obviously want to try and tie him down to a contract as soon as possible for the long term, because it's critical for Red Bull's progress and sustained level of dominance, I suppose, if you like, for the years ahead, that they tie down not just the reigning world champion, but also the hottest property in Formula One right now, for the foreseeable future. It's one of those that you'd expect it to happen, and I would say, whilst in theory that does seem likely, you'd almost be tempted to think, if you were Max Verstappen right now, that you don't really want to hedge your bet straight away. You'd want to see how the season starts and see what the pecking order is. And if, as you say, Courtney, there's a situation where Lewis Hamilton decides he doesn't want to do it anymore, perhaps even this season, he may decide that he doesn't want to start this season and retire altogether. I don't think that's likely, but let's entertain the idea that it happens. There's that possibility that Mercedes may be forced to draft in someone in the short term, which gives Max a golden opportunity to have a look at what they're doing. And then if they are performing so much better than Red Bull, he can say, look, guys, if you need a long-term solution, I'm your guy. I can be taking over, if you like. And I don't think Mercedes would pass up that opportunity, if I'm brutally honest. I mean, Carlos Sainz at Ferrari, I think this is just one that's there for the sake, because it's there. All the stories are coming out saying that Ferrari are trying to tie him down to a longer-term deal. For an extra year or two on top of his current contract. So I would say, of all the drivers in that list, I think that's the one that will most likely stay where they are beyond 2022, even more so than Max at Red Bull, as you said, for the reasons we've just mentioned already.
With Carlos quickly, is obviously Santander have come back into sport as sponsor for Carlos Sainz, not for Fernando Alonso, but for Carlos Sainz. So there's the big marketing in Spain. That's another reason why I would say Ferrari want to keep that sponsorship at least. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And it's going to bring that nice red and white livery that we saw in the most of the 2010s, really, with Ferrari and Santander renewing that partnership long term. And as you said, Sainz a huge part of that. And I'd be very surprised if Ferrari suddenly decide they don't want Carlos Sainz, especially after the season he had last season. It's only going to get better.
So well.
Speaking of sponsors, I was reading the other day that Mercedes have lost their sponsors Boss and Epson, who deal with the communications devices and headsets that they were using. Kind of a bit ironic, really, given that those were the things that we saw Toto Wolff constantly smashing in the Mercedes garage, especially at the last race when he was getting a good use out of that headset, telling Mikey that it's not right. And after Brazil as well, I think, if I remember rightly. But I don't think they're related, but it probably wasn't good. Well, it might have been. It might have been great for their product if they were still able to use them afterwards. It might prove that they're durable, really, because, modern technology these days, you seem to drop it and it breaks. Not like the old Nokia 3310s that seem to have the battery life of 100 suns and also the durability of as many as well, I suppose. So, it's quite interesting just seeing that. But it's a good point, Lee, with Carlos Sainz. Absolute, improving commodity, I suppose, is the right way of putting it at Ferrari. So, I think that's one that is in the list, but won't be there for much longer. We see Fernando Alonso in that list as well. El Plan could be taking a big step forward in its shape next season, and based on what Alpine are saying, they seem to be rather buoyant and optimistic. And I think a lot of us are kind of hoping that it is, because we want to see Fernando in that fight, especially what he demonstrated last season, that he certainly could be a factor in that battle. So what are you guys' thoughts on that one with Fernando? Do you think that he will stay beyond his current contract if Alpine produce a car that's capable of challenging for race wins?
Yeah, 2022 is the reason why Fernando Alonso come back. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. He's gone back to the Enstone-based team, where obviously he had a lot of success. So that's like a second home for him. So those two reasons combined, that's why he's come back. If they struggle, I think he'll start putting question marks over his future. On the same subject, I think that's why Sebastian Vettel chose to move to Aston Martin, because Aston Martin were being very ambitious about the future. So Sebastian Vettel is another one where I feel if Aston Martin struggle or they start tailing off, Sebastian Vettel could be one of the main ones to watch, actually. I should have mentioned him earlier. If he struggles again, or his relationship with Stroll starts to sour, given who's in charge at Aston Martin, Sebastian Vettel could rethink his future in Formula One altogether.
Yeah, that is certainly one to be concerned about, because I think we all know that Seb is not going to be here probably to realise the success, I suppose, excuse me, of the Aston Martin project. If it takes as long as we expect it to come to fruition, where they're at the top, sort of 3 or 4 years from now, we don't expect Seb to still be in F1 at that time. So it's something that they kind of need to produce some sort of tangible progress now to give him the idea that if he sticks around for another year or two, he may be able to be in a position where he could potentially win a world championship again. Seb, car number 5 with 5 world titles, always has a nice ring to it. But, if they're not going to give Seb the car to do that, there's no point him sticking around. Lee, what are your thoughts on those two drivers, Fernando and Seb? Kind of in the same boat with this one, really. There's quite an age gap between the two of them, but both of them kind of have the same sort of ambitions for their teams, at least in the medium term.
I completely agree. They're not. Fernando's done back of the grid. He doesn't want to do that again. So if Alpine produced a dog of a car, he's not going to stick around. He'll be like, "Yeah, didn't work. That was fun. See you later." And Sebastian, it'd be the same thing. Of he does want to be back of the grid. He's been there with Ferrari, so to speak, with their obviously challenging year. And he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be there either. And he has spoken before about the thoughts of spending time with his family and not being involved in the sport. So yeah, if the car is rubbish and the whole relationship sours, I wouldn't be surprised if he walks away either.
Yeah, very true. And we should also mention, on the perspective of the teams as well, Alpine and Aston Martin, that whilst they are obviously loving the idea of having seasoned veterans like Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel in their team, which I'm sure is invaluable to them in terms of what they can bring, there are plenty of drivers that they already have on their books, or drivers that they're keeping an eye on, that will be more than happy to step in, and perhaps for a longer term project might be better for them in that regard. I mean, Alpine, with someone like Oscar Piastri, after Ocon signed a new long-term deal with the team last season at the French Grand Prix, they're obviously going to be looking at their next young star in him to try and get him in that car as soon as they can. How they're going to manufacture that, I don't know, because if they produce a top car and Fernando is still driving at an incredibly high level, you're not exactly going to say to Fernando, no, we don't want you in that car, unless you've got a really good reason for it. Whereas at Aston Martin, it might be a bit easier for them to make that decision with Seb, because, of course, Seb's mindset has kind of drifted away from just the F1 life now. He's been thinking about that family life, as you mentioned, Lee. The wholesome guy that he is. There's plenty of things that he can be concentrating his time on, the humanitarian work that he does off circuit, and just enjoying that private life that he loves so much as well. So we'll have to wait and see, but that's something that both of those teams are going to have to keep an eye on. We should briefly mention Pierre Gasly and Yuki Sonoda. Both of them in the final year of their contract with AlphaTauri, both fighting for their futures for different reasons. Pierre Gasly certainly looking to try and make himself a more attractive commodity within the program that he currently exists in at Red Bull. It doesn't seem like the door is completely closed to a return at Red Bull, but if you were Pierre Gasly, guys, would you be more interested in trying to show off your skills for other teams for next season, or would you rather try and see if there's an avenue back at the Red Bull senior team beyond? Because something has got to happen with Pierre Gasly one way or the other. It seems he's been in a bit of purgatory almost, and he's trying to make the best of it.
Yeah, I think Pierre Gasly is one of the drivers that would benefit most from a domino effect. I can't see him being sort of the first driver to make a move, let's say, because I just feel that with the top teams, barring maybe Lewis at Mercedes, all their top drivers are probably going to stay. There's always a question mark over Sergio Perez, because we know how Red Bull can be with their second drivers. So I think that the only option that's sort of open to him right now is a potential going back to Red Bull. But if there's a shift at one of those top teams, Pierre Gasly will be one of the names on the list. So, obviously, if Perez was to go, say hypothetically, Sainz was to leave, or if George Russell, for whatever reason, was to leave Mercedes after one season, they'd all be looking at Pierre Gasly, because I think Pierre Gasly is of the caliber to support a top team and sometimes challenge for wins. I think we've seen over the past couple of seasons in particular, the guy has the ability to do it, but he needs to be looked after. I don't feel he's looked after at Red Bull. That's just my opinion. I don't think he's looked after very well at all. And his confidence took a very public hit, let's say, and then his time back at AlphaTauri, he's got his confidence back. So he just needs to be in the right environment, because when the guy's treated well, he performs brilliantly.
No, absolutely right. There does seem with that domino effect that there's going to be a few seats in particular that could trigger it. I think the Lewis Hamilton situation, as it stands right now, is a potential domino effect. Has a potential domino effect following that. I mean, it has to, given how huge the seat is, and obviously what the ramifications will be, that practically almost every single driver on the grid would be interested in it if it become available to them. And possibly Sergio Perez's seat as well, for different reasons at Red Bull, because again, he's going to be hoping to improve on last season. You know, he did seem to show progress towards the end of last season at Red Bull. And obviously that was enough to keep him on with the team for another year, but he's going to have to continue on that. And again, there are going to be plenty of drivers looking at that seat. If I was a betting man, I would say Pierre Gasly would be the driver to step in if Sergio doesn't stay on next season. But again, you know, it's all going to play into what Red Bull want to do and what situation they find themselves in next season as well. A lot of things could change beyond their control. With Max Verstappen as well. Lee, any final thoughts on the Pierre Gasly, Yuki Tsunoda situation? I mean, we talked a lot about Pierre Gasly. Perhaps some thoughts on Yuki Tsunoda's situation next season.
I think with Yuki, he's shown signs of improvement over last season, but not the kind of performance I think Red Bull were looking for. So I think this is very much Yuki's make or break season. If he has a similar season to last year, I don't think Yuki will be kept on, and the Red Bull will move on to another young driver. They will be expecting a big improvement from Yuki, and that's what I expect. If he can deliver that, that's obviously going to be down to him and how he approaches the season. Obviously, the car, but his own performance. He obviously cuts out some of the mistakes and the silly crashes that he did last year, and I think Red Bull will be happy, but he needs to show signs of improvement or he's not going to be there come next year.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Well, before we sort of round this all off, guys, I want to open the floor to my two co-hosts with me to just throw up some other things that we're going to be looking forward to in 2022 that I haven't already mentioned. So, guys, the floor is yours. Anything you can throw at me right now, things that we're looking forward to in 2022 that we can talk about, can go for it.
Yeah, I got one.
Go on, you go first, Lee.
Oh, sorry, Courtney.
No, Lee,
you go.
Is the if we're going to have a potential race ban? That's something that I'm interested about. Obviously, this isn't a prediction episode, but the two highest penalty points for drivers are for Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, and 7 apiece. So that would be interesting, especially if Max is involved in another close championship battle this year. Will Max have a one race ban? More than Sergio, because if I recall, Max's first penalty points don't fall off till September.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
12 or 13 races where Max will have to avoid penalties if he's in a championship battle, which will be very close.
Yeah, I mean,
if he is involved, I mean,
usually when it comes to overtaking and incidents on track, Max Verstappen certainly pushes the limits, and I think we've seen evidently last year that because of the inconsistency that we saw, that kind of gave license for Max to try and just take as much liberties as he could or push the rules as far as they go. That's how he's very uncompromising as a driver like that. You know, not necessarily saying that it's wrong to drive that way, but when you've got the rules the way they are, he certainly pushes them to their limits in that regard. And sometimes he's right and sometimes he's not. But last season, we did see a lot of that. It come as a punishment of his actions, come in the form of penalty points. In seasons gone past where that's not necessarily been the case. So you're rightly, there is the possibility where not just him, but other drivers as well could run the risk if they, constantly in the wrong. put themselves in a position where they get a race ban. Courtney, do you want to weigh on this one?
Oh, am I allowed to speak on this? Because I might be accused of being a fanboy again.
Well, I think we're both past that point now. As long as you try and cater to both sides, that way you're accused of calling it down the middle. I think we're all right.
Well, if Max continues to drive, he has been, particularly towards the end of the season, and yeah, he's going to end up with a race ban. And I mean, it would look good for a world champion to get a race ban, would it? Doesn't look good. But I just think, I discussed it earlier on of the last few weeks that I just feel that Max Verstappen needs to be managed better to avoid that happening, because he's a great driver. But I just think that his behaviours are enabled too much by certain people, Christian Horner, that lead to him getting into these tangles more often than he should, because it's unnecessary. The guy has the speed to win many races and championships. So let's hope he can avoid a race ban, because it wouldn't look good if he did.
Yeah, very true. And you never know. We may see a different type of Max Verstappen next season, given that he has won a world championship now. There may be not necessarily desperation, but there might be less of an urgency about the way that he drives. Maybe he might become a bit more methodical like Lewis is, and obviously Lewis had to take those necessary steps to become that during his younger days in F1 as well. So we'll have to wait and see. That's a really good one, actually. Courtney, what was the one that you were going to bring to us to look forward to for 2022?
For me, like, I've already raised it. I think the Sainz and Leclerc battle. I really, really do believe that's one to look at, because I don't think many people expected Carlos Sainz to get the better of Charles Leclerc the way he did, because Charles Leclerc was the main guy at Ferrari. I'll never forget when he won that race at Monza, where he became the main guy, and Sebastian Vettel obviously went into the background and ended up losing his seat. So, and with the Santander thing, I find that interesting, because, that's extra investment that's been brought in because of Carlos Sainz. Carlos Sainz isn't there to be a number 2 driver. If they have the right package to go for a championship in particular, we could see another Hamilton and Rosberg between these guys. It's something to really potentially look forward to. Don't understate it.
Yeah, it's certainly a one battle in particular that's going to be intriguing. I mean, I have to put a caveat on this for last season, because as impressed as I was with Sainz and as brilliant as he was over the course of the season, Leclerc's season, I think, has been looked at quite unfavourably because of the way the championship situation looks compared to how it should have been. He was incredibly lucky on last season, Charles Leclerc. I think there was quite a few races where he was, on course to get some big points, and for reasons out of his control, he was denied that. And I think if you take that into account, his season looks a lot better than it actually was. I mean, he went into the last race best of the rest, and it was only a poor strategy call that's cost him that. And even then, if he'd have won it by a few points, it still wouldn't have been a fair reflection on his performance over the course of the season. That being said, the fact that Sainz was consistent throughout the whole season, I think it was like 20 points finishes over the season. I think only Verstappen did more than that. And 14 of those came in succession. That is something that's going to serve him so well. And of course, Ferrari will want to build on that with him. They will probably feel perhaps the next step for him is to try and get a race win. And it's something that won't be ignored. So it's definitely going to be an interesting battle. I don't know if it's going to be as fiery or feisty as perhaps what we've seen with Sebastian Vettel when Charles Leclerc was in the team with him, but it certainly does raise a few eyebrows, especially when we're talking about the guy that Ferrari have kind of put all their hope and faith into being the next star in that team. They gave him a bigger contract 2 years ago than what they ever gave to Michael Schumacher, which shows the absolute confidence that they have in him, and perhaps at a time when Ferrari needed to tie down an asset like that when they obviously weren't performing. So there's a bit of that too. It's going to be interesting. I mean, there's quite a few battles up and down the grid that we're going to see next season, but that is the one I agree that will create some fireworks. Perhaps Norris and Ricciardo equally at McLaren. I think there's a score there that needs to be settled. I think Ricciardo definitely needs to up his game, because he was handsomely beat by Lando Norris, and he will not want to take that line down. He will want to do something about that and reassert himself in that team, because if he's not able to, that will raise questions over his future at the team. Lee, what are your thoughts on those two potential battles next season, the inter-team battles at least?
So on Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, it's definitely, if they have the correct car, I completely agree. It's going to be interesting to watch, and it could be a very fiery situation, because they're both not very much where heart on the sleeve, because that was more Sebastian, but they're very strong with their verbal with their emotions. So it will be interesting to see, obviously, if there's a close fight between the two of them. I still think, going on our previous episode, Charles didn't perform as well over the course of the season as Carlos, but that we touched on the previous episode. But yeah, I'm more excited, personally, with the McLaren Daniel Ricciardo. I want Daniel Ricciardo back. That's what I'm looking forward to. Daniel Ricciardo back. I don't know where he went last year, but he wasn't, apart from Monza, he wasn't racing.
Well, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So hopefully he's tripping Australia, connecting with family, has cured his homesickness, because he obviously said he was missing home a bit, missing his family, and not seeing them for nearly 2 years. So hopefully he comes back revitalized and be like, "Oi, you, Lando, the honey badger's here." There'd be a nice, obviously not in that exact words, because I'm sure he'll come up with a much more interesting, elaborate phrase than I just come up with. But yeah, that's going to be a really exciting one for me. Is hopefully Daniel coming back and taking it to Lando.
Yeah, I think we can all agree one thing we want to see next season is a few more shoeies than we got last year. A few more days like Monza would be nice, in the Daniel Ricciardo camp. One thing I do want to see next season, or will be interested to see next season for 2022, and it has to be, the lessons learned from the FIA and the stewards officiating last season. Obvious reasons, that is the headline thing that I think a lot of us will be keeping an eye on next season. And, the inconsistencies and the confusion was laid bare for us as, considerably earlier in the season than it ended up being towards the end in such a way. So I think to kind of summarize that to a point is, will the FIA and the stewards learn from their mistakes and create a more robust system, a more consistent system that they can operate, on a race-by-race basis that, not necessarily gets the fans on side, because, fans of other sports will mention one consistent thing is that no one likes the officials, no one likes the refs. They're the least popular people, but they are there for a reason. And I think next season, based on what we saw towards the end of last season, that one thing that we do need is a set of regulations that do not lend themselves to interpretation on a situation based on loads of different circumstances that aren't relevant, but just judging something based on its merits and create a system that, even if you are wronged against, you can at least understand why it's happening and expect that to be applied in the same way when someone else does the same thing in the future. I know it sounds like I'm kind of rambling on with this one, but I want to get your guys' thoughts on this one before we wrap this up, because this is quite a big thing. Ultimately, it decided the championship last season, and it did leave a stain on an otherwise, legendary battle between two of the greats of F1 history, for different times in their careers. So, what are we thinking on this one? Do we expect improvements, or do we feel that there's a fear that we may have opened up a can of worms where the similar sorts of precedents are going to be followed or not followed, and we're just going to get a lot more exposure to it because we're now more diligent to those sorts of things happening?
Oh, there needs to be a change 100%. I think, given everything we've discussed this episode, it's Formula One's going through, we don't know the size of it yet, but it's going through a rebirth, a rebranding. And the stewarding certainly needs to change, because right now the reputation of the sport is in the mud. I think we can't sugarcoat that fact, as much as we love the sport. In terms of its general, the general population's perception of the sport, particularly those aren't into Formula One massively, the sport is in the mud. So the stewarding needs to change big time, and it needs to set the standards from the first race of the season. I'm hoping that we see the end of the debacle, which is the live broadcasting of the team principals talking to the stewards, because to start with, we all thought it was entertaining, but it just got silly towards the end. It became a bit of a mockery. So I just think the stewarding, you're right, Adam, that the stewarding needs to change, but it needs to change straight away, because right now there's such little faith in the integrity, whether you agree with it or not. There's a lot of bad feeling towards the integrity of race results. So they have a lot of work to do, but they have to hit the ground running straight away for it to work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one. What about you, Lee? What are your thoughts on the need to improve F1's integrity, I suppose is the right way of putting it based on what Courtney's just said?
I would have said it needs to happen. If it happens, I doubt it. Like any organisation of that size, it's very bureaucratic. They'll go, oh, we've done a review of what happened at the end of the season. We're going to form this working group. We're going to discuss it. We're going to speak to Michael Massey. We reviewed it. We think it was fine. Nothing was really an issue. We maybe do this as an outcome of the group, but that will take a year or so to do their discussions and slightly pat on the back. Job well done. That was very good. Oh, we did a great job. Lovely. And even if they do a suggestion, they'll be like, oh, we need to do a vote on it because the rule are doing it majority. And the older bureaucratic of going back to the teams, if the teams have a certain, nothing will happen, is unfortunately my opinion. As much as I think it should, I don't think anything will come out of it. I'm sorry to be pessimistic there.
No, it's fine because I get it. You know, as a fan of the sport, as long as we've been, a lot of people were talking about this, like, you know, in isolation. They're talking about this incident at Abu Dhabi as if like, oh my God, where has this come from? No one expected this, like the worst thing ever. But if you look through F1's history, these sorts of things, not necessarily to that degree, that's only happened once or twice in F1 history. I mean, we're talking 1989 in Japan as an example, if you like, and between Senna and Prost and how obviously what was going on there. But there have been loads of periods in F1 history where there have been these inconsistencies, this bureaucratic approach to some of these instances where certain teams will get favoritism or certain drivers will get favoritism or certain things will happen that aren't in the best interest of the sport, and it does leave the integrity up to scrutiny. And more often than not, you kind of get fed the line that they will seek to learn the lessons or improve or find out what happened, how we can mitigate it, and then over a certain amount of time that doesn't really happen. I think what's different about this situation is that it involves arguably one of F1's greatest ever assets, and certainly the greatest asset today, who does carry a lot of following, not necessarily from people inside F1, but people that are new to F1, people that will very easily turn their back on Formula One if it goes against, you know, those sort of principles and goes against Lewis Hamilton in this regard. I mean, for example, I like to listen to other podcasts, not just in F1, football ones as well. I listen to an Arsenal podcast. I think it's Arseblog, one of the biggest ones out there. So if they listen to this, shout out to those guys. Really good at what they do. And even they were talking about this incident. And this is a football podcast specifically for a football team where it's completely in isolation what's going on with a football club. But they're comparing what happened at the weekend between Arsenal and Man City. And for those that understand what happened there, they'll get where I'm going with this. But they were comparing it to Formula One in the fact that people were talking about Formula One on the socials, like with this particular incident, and that it's not something you normally see. You don't see people clogging up the socials with it, talking about this stuff that, you know, Formula One is obviously a big talking point, but the fact that it brings up so much interest for wrong reasons kind of highlights the problems that Formula One need to address. So as much as I agree with you, Lee, that Formula One and the FIA, will they seek to try and improve this? Probably not. I think they're kind of in a position where they kind of have to now, because the landscape of modern media and modern fan interest and new sets of fans that F1 have worked so hard to bring in. I mean, we saw the crowds at Austin and the crowds at Mexico. You didn't see those 5 years ago. In other places around the world that obviously there's an increased fanfare. If you don't change F1 and make it better as a sport and improve the integrity that's been so tarnished by what we've seen, that's going to erode away and you'll never get it back. You will never get that back. So I do agree with you, Lee. I really, really do. But I just hope that we're wrong and that
I agree.
They change this, because they can't afford to just lay down those old foundations that we saw with, not to name drop, but a few characters that people remember from the 80s and 90s and even the early noughties as well, where they just overlook certain things because of who's involved, just for the sake of the bureaucratic approach. It just can't exist anymore in Formula One. It really can't. Courtney, any more final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I just feel that the sport in general is in the mud when it comes to stewarding. So I think we're all in agreement. Things need to change, and they need to change right away.
Yeah, absolutely. One more thing, obviously, wanted to bring up quickly. Just seeing stuff on the socials while we're talking about that. As a lot of drivers obviously doing some nice things on their winter break, and Lando Norris seems to have been doing the rounds on his socials because of a photo of him out in Dubai with his new girlfriend. And yeah, all I can say to that is yeah, fantastic. Good for you, Lando. Well done. Hope you and your new girlfriend are having a great time. And I think that's about all we can say on that one, really, compared to most people on the socials that seem to be having a different kind of reaction, which I can't believe we're talking about this with a Formula One driver involved. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, yeah, let's wrap that up. I just wanted to bring that up because I think the only appropriate response to see that is good for him, good for her. They look like they're having a wonderful time.
Good on you, son.
Yeah, good on you, mate. Good on you. And you never know, that might improve his performances. When you're kind of mentally in that right space, it can do wonders for you. So, yeah, let's see how that works out for him. Anyway, I think there's nothing more that we can say on that one. I wanted to leave it on a nice note. I didn't want to have a big rant about the steward. I wanted to lift up the mood of everybody before we wrap this episode up. But as I said already, guys, if you have enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the YouTube channel. It's absolutely free to do so, and we'd absolutely love you if you would consider doing that for us. Of course, we are chasing that 500 subscribers milestone, and we want to get to 1,000 by the end of 2022. So obviously the big way of doing that, get us on the right front, is to get us over 500 as soon as we can. Of course, if you are listening to us on your favorite podcasting platform, you can also follow us as well. If you can, of course, we would love it if you guys could give us a nice review on there. It doesn't necessarily have to be 5 stars if you don't think we're worthy of that. We understand that, but we would love it if you guys could give us a review. And of course, if there's anything in particular you want us to improve on, please do let us know, because if you don't give us any feedback, we're just assuming we're doing everything right. We want to improve for you guys, of course. But nonetheless, of course, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.
Goodbye.